For 30 years I was Evelyn Pierce, a devoted wife living a life most people only dream of. I stood by my husband as he built an empire, believing our family was my greatest achievement. Then he died. The day of his funeral, my own son took my purse, my phone, and my keys. He looked me in the eye and said, "Get out," leaving me on the curb with nothing. He thought he had taken everything. He had no idea about the secrets I kept or the woman he was about to unleash. This is the story of how I lost it all, and how I'm going to take it all back with interest. Follow my journey for revenge. Don't forget to subscribe for new chapters. Hit like if you're ready for the payback, and comment below what you think his fate should be. The air in our home was thick with the scent of lilies and professionally managed grief. Friends and business associates of my late husband, Richard, moved through the grand foyer, their hushed condolences falling like soft, useless rain. I stood by the large bay window overlooking the manicured lawns, a ghost in my own home. My son Mark was the center of it all. At 32, he was the spitting image of his father in his prime, tall, sharp, and dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to repel sorrow. He accepted handshakes and hugs with a practiced solemnity that made my skin crawl. After the last guest finally departed, leaving behind a wake of half-empty glasses and wilting sympathy, the silence that fell was heavier than the preceding noise. I turned from the window. Mark was at the kitchen's marble island, not looking at me, his focus on a thick manila envelope. "We need to talk," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion. I walked toward him, my sensible funeral heels clicking softly on the Italian tile. "Mark, can this not wait? I'm so tired." "No, it can't." He slid the envelope across the cool, smooth stone. It stopped just short of my hand. "The will is clear. Dad's lawyer went over it with me this morning while you were otherwise occupied." I flinched at the insinuation. I had been at the funeral home, making the final arrangements for Richard's cremation, a task Mark had declared himself too busy to handle. I reached for the envelope, but my hands trembled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying everything is mine now," he said, finally looking up. His eyes, the same deep blue as Richard's, were cold, flat stones. "The company, the portfolio, his house, everything." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, nonsensical and cruel. "Mark, that's not possible. Your father and I built this life together." "He built it. You were an accessory," he spat, the words so venomous they echoed what Richard himself had once feared. "And your services are no longer required." He stood up, towering over me. "I want you out. Tonight." A laugh escaped my lips, a dry, incredulous puff of air. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would I go?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Not pity, but irritation. He walked to the hall closet, grabbed my handbag from the hook where I'd left it, and came back. He opened it and tipped the contents onto the counter. My wallet, my reading glasses, a tube of lipstick. He pocketed my credit cards and debit cards, leaving only a few stray dollar bills. Then he picked up my phone. "You won't be needing these," he said, his voice a low, terrifying monotone. He strode to the front door and held it open. "I've already had the locks changed. A car will be here in the morning to take the rest of your things to a storage unit. You can figure out how to get them from there." I was paralyzed, a statue of disbelief. This was my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose nightmares I had soothed. He was looking at me as if I were a stranger, a nuisance to be disposed of. "Get out, Mom," he said, the last word a final, twisting knife. He didn't push me. He didn't have to. The force of his hatred was a physical thing, propelling me out of the home I had loved for 30 years and onto the cold stone of the porch. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the sound as final as a casket closing. I was left on the curb of my own life, with nothing but the clothes on my back, as I watched my son's car engine roar to life and disappear down the long, dark driveway. The evening air of Greenwich was cool and damp, seeping through the thin fabric of my black funeral dress. I stood there for a long time, staring at the perfectly illuminated facade of my former home, waiting for a punchline that never came. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows. I started walking. My heels, chosen for a few hours of somber standing, were a form of torture on the asphalt. Each step sent a jarring pain up my legs. I had no destination. To the left was the country club, a bastion of fake smiles and quiet judgments. To the right, the main road, a river of headlights flowing toward worlds that were no longer mine. Chose the main road. Cars sped past, their occupants cocooned in warmth and purpose. I was an anomaly, a disheveled woman in black walking along the shoulder of a road meant only for driving. I thought about flagging someone down, but what would I say? My son just threw me out of my house and stole my life savings. They'd think I was insane. Hours bled together. My feet were raw, and a deep, gnawing cold had settled into my bones. I finally saw the fluorescent oasis of a 24-hour gas station and hobbled toward it, desperate. The young man behind the counter watched me with suspicion as I approached. Can I please use your phone?" asked my voice hoarse. "It's an emergency." He sized me up, the wrinkled dress, the stray leaves clinging to my skirt, the wild look in my eyes. "Phones for paying customers only," he said, turning his attention back to the small television on the counter. "Please," I begged, leaning against the counter for support. "My son, Look, lady, I don't want any trouble." He cut me off, his hand inching toward the phone on the wall. "You need to buy something or leave. Otherwise, I'm calling the cops." The threat hung in the air, thick and greasy like the smell of old hot dogs on the roller grill. Please. What would they do? Take me to a hospital? A psych ward? I was a non-person. I had no ID, no money, no story that sounded sane. Defeated, I turned and pushed my way back out into the night. The reality of my situation crashed down with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just homeless. I was invisible. I was nothing. My walk ended at a regional bus station, a sad beige building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. It was the only place that offered shelter without question. I found a hard plastic chair in a poorly lit corner and sank into it, my body screaming with a pain so profound it was almost a comfort. At least the pain was real. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the past refused to stay buried. I saw Richard's face everywhere, not the smiling, confident man the world knew, but the frail version from his final years. His mind and body slowly being betrayed by a degenerative illness. I remembered one night, long after the doctors had given us the diagnosis. He'd grabbed my hand with a surprising strength. "He sees you as an accessory, Eve," Richard had whispered, his voice thin but urgent. He was talking about Mark. "He's always resented you. Resented that I loved you. When I'm gone, he'll see you as just another asset to be liquidated." "Don't say that, Richard." I'd hushed him, my heart breaking. "He's your son. He's my son. Biology doesn't make a man decent," he'd insisted, his eyes boring into mine. "He has a hole in him where his heart should be. Promise me you'll protect yourself, Eve. Promise me you won't let him leave you with nothing." I'd made the promise to appease him, never truly believing it would be necessary. Now, huddled in the grime of the bus station, his words were a prophecy fulfilled. The grief that had numbed me for days began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning spark. It was the flicker of anger. Richard had seen this coming. And I, in my blind maternal love, had refused to believe it. The cold fear was still there, a coiled snake in my stomach, but now it had a companion, rage. Morning came not with a sunrise, but with the harsh clatter of the station's steel shutters being rolled up. The handful of other souls who had taken refuge in the terminal began to stir, gathering their meager belongings. I hadn't slept. My whole body was a single, throbbing ache. Thirst was a physical pain in my throat. I knew I couldn't survive without help. Swallowing the jagged shard of my pride, I walked out onto the street. I stood near a coffee shop, watching people rush by on their way to work, their faces set with purpose. I tried to speak, but the words, "Can you spare some change?" felt like ash in my mouth. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and shameful. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I looked up to see a young woman, no older than 25, with kind eyes and a blue barista apron. She was holding a cardboard tray of coffees. I couldn't form a sentence. I just shook my head, the motion dislodging another tear. She didn't recoil. She didn't look away. Instead, she set her tray down on a nearby ledge. "You look like you could use this more than my coworkers," she said, handing me one of the coffees. She went into the shop and came back a moment later with a bagel in a paper bag. "Here." "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "Rough night?" she asked gently. I gave her a heavily edited version of my story. My husband passed away, and there were complications with the family. I had to leave my home suddenly. I left out the part about my son, the cruelty, the theft. It was too raw, too unbelievable. She just nodded, listening without judgment. When I was finished, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. "It's not much," she said, pressing it into my hand. "There's a women's shelter on Elm Street, about 6 blocks from here. They can help you get on your feet. Please go there." I tried to refuse the money, but she insisted. "Someone did something similar for me once," she said with a small smile. "Just pay it forward someday." She picked up her coffee tray and hurried off to work, leaving me on the sidewalk clutching the warm cup and the crisp bill. It was more than just coffee and money. It was a small, vital act of kindness that cleared a space in the fog of my panic. It gave me the breath I needed to stop reacting and start thinking. The women's shelter on Elm Street was loud, crowded, and smelled of bleach and boiled vegetables. It was a world away from the hushed elegance of my old life, but it was safe and it was warm. I was given a cot in a large dormitory room, a thin blanket, and a bowl of stew. I ate mechanically, blocking out the noise and the stories of the women around me. Their tragedies were loud, their pain worn on the outside. My own tragedy was a quiet, internal thing, a void where my life used to be. But as I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, I felt the anger from the bus station crystallize into something harder, something with purpose. Richard's warning, the barista's kindness, my son's cold eyes. They were all pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. There was a number I had been replaying in my head for the past 12 hours, a sequence of 10 digits I had forced myself to memorize over a decade ago. It was a failsafe, last resort, a plan born from a husband's foresight and a wife's reluctant agreement. I found the payphone in the shelter's main hallway, its plastic receiver greasy to the touch. With trembling fingers, I dropped a coin in the slot and dialed the number. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. What if it was disconnected? What if it was a delusion? Rang once. A crisp, professional voice answered, a voice that was calm, clear, and utterly reassuring. "Davies, Miller and Finch. We've been waiting for your call, Miss Stone." The voice on the phone was the anchor I needed in the swirling chaos of my life. Following Mr. Davies' calm, precise instructions, I left the shelter at dawn. A bus ticket to Philadelphia was waiting for me at the station's counter, booked under the name Eleanor Stone. The simple act of saying the name out loud to the clerk felt both like a lie and a liberation. The bus ride was a 4-hour journey from one life to another. With every mile that separated me from Greenwich, the skin of Evelyn Pierce felt thinner, more translucent. I watched the manicured suburbs of Connecticut bleed into the gritty, industrial landscapes of New Jersey, and finally, the historic brick and steel of Philadelphia. The law firm of Davies, Miller and Finch was not a towering glass skyscraper. It was a discreet, elegant brownstone on a quiet square, its old-world charm radiating competence and confidentiality. A receptionist led me to a wood-paneled office where a man in his late 60s stood to greet me. He was tall and impeccably dressed, with kind eyes that held no pity, only a deep professional respect. "Miss Stone," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I am Arthur Davies. Your husband was a dear friend." I am so sorry for your loss, and for the circumstances that brought you here. He gestured for me to sit and placed a heavy, dark leather briefcase on the polished mahogany desk between us. Richard and I set this up over 10 years ago. He called it the Phoenix Clause. For a day he hoped would never arrive. He opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled in custom foam cutouts, was my new life. A United States passport and a Pennsylvania driver's license, both bearing my face but the name Eleanor Stone. A set of credit cards in the same name. A simple, elegant key fob. And a sleek new smartphone, still in its plastic wrapping. Everything is active and ready for your use, Mr. Davies said. The phone is secure. The keys are for your new residence. It is paid for in full. I picked up the passport, the smooth, cool cover feeling impossibly solid in my hands. Eleanor Stone. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a ghost. She was real. And for the first time since I'd stood on that curb, I felt the ground beneath my feet. Richard was a brilliant businessman, Mr. Davies explained, pouring me a glass of water. But he was not naive. He saw Mark's ambition, his ruthlessness. He worried it would one day be turned on you. He detailed the structure of the Phoenix Clause. For 15 years, a small, legally vetted percentage of Richard's income from his overseas ventures Mark knew nothing about, had been diverted into a series of blind trusts and investment vehicles. They were managed by this firm under my new, legally established identity. It was my insurance policy, my escape hatch. The grief I felt was sharp and sudden. This was the ultimate love letter from my husband, an act of protection that reached beyond the grave. He hadn't just loved me. He had seen me, understood my vulnerability, and built me a fortress. The funds are substantial, Mr. Davies said, his voice gentle. More than enough to live a very comfortable life. Or, he paused, his gaze sharp and knowing, they are enough to be a weapon. That evening, a quiet car service took me to an address in Old City. The key fob unlocked the door to a stunning modern loft apartment in a converted warehouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Delaware River, the lights of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge glittering like a diamond necklace. The space was minimalist, clean, and furnished with a cool, contemporary elegance. It was the complete antithesis of the traditional, antique-filled home I had shared with Richard. There were no memories here. No ghosts. It was a blank canvas. Standing in the center of the vast living room, bathed in the city lights, I took my first deep, unfettered breath. This was not a shelter. It was a command center. I spent the first week adjusting. I bought new clothes, sharp, tailored pieces in shades of charcoal, navy, and black. I cut my hair into a chic, no-nonsense bob. I learned the rhythms of my new city and my new name. But I wasn't on vacation. I was preparing for war. My first call as Eleanor Stone was back to Mr. Davies. I need an investigator, I said. The best. He recommended Jessica Riley, a former SEC enforcement agent who now ran a boutique corporate intelligence firm. She was sharp, discreet, and had a reputation for finding skeletons in the most well-guarded closets. We met at a sterile coffee shop. I told her I was an investor considering a move on a company called Pierce Industries. I needed a complete deep-dive profile on its leadership. I didn't let on that its CEO was my son. A week later, Jessica delivered a detailed report that made my blood run cold. Confirmed everything. Mark had worked in concert with David Chen, Richard's ambitious and ruthless chief operating officer. The report detailed their meetings in the weeks leading up to Richard's death, the legal maneuvers they'd prepared, the swiftness of their coup. David was the architect of my removal. But the report also gave me my first weapon. It uncovered David Chen's weakness, a secret and crippling gambling addiction. He was in deep with debts to some very dangerous people. And Mark, in his arrogance, had given David complete control over the company's operating accounts. It was a fatal mistake. Rage is a powerful fuel, but it is a poor strategist. I knew I couldn't move rashly. I had money and a nascent plan, but I needed knowledge. My enemy was the world I had only ever experienced from the passenger seat. I turned my new loft into a school. I spent 12 hours a day devouring information. I studied corporate law, hostile takeovers, and market vulnerabilities. I subscribed to every trade publication in the high-end manufacturing sector that Pierce Industries dominated. I learned the language of leveraged buyouts, supply chain logistics, and quarterly earnings reports. The woman who once planned charity galas now tracked commodities futures. My most important discovery came from a deep dive into the company's financial disclosures, which Jessica had acquired. To fund an aggressive and frankly reckless expansion plan immediately after taking over, Mark and David had done exactly what Richard had always cautioned against. They had leveraged the company to the hilt, taking on an enormous amount of debt from a consortium of banks. They saw it as a bold move, a show of strength. I saw it for what it was. A beautiful, exposed flank. A chain they had wrapped around their own necks. All I needed to do was find a way to pull on it. My first move wasn't made with a phone call or a threat. It was made with a quiet wire transfer. On the advice of Mr. Davies, I used my capital to establish a series of anonymous shell corporations, registered in Delaware and layered so intricately that tracing them back to Eleanor Stone would be a forensic nightmare. Then, through these anonymous corporate entities, I began to move. Started small. One of the smaller banks in the consortium had overextended itself and was looking to offload some of its loan portfolio to improve its balance sheet. My primary shell corporation, Athena Strategic Holdings, made an offer. We bought Pierce Industries' debt from them at a slight discount. To Mark and David, it would have been a meaningless notification on a report. A debt instrument transferred from one faceless financial institution to another. They wouldn't have given it a second thought. But I did. As I sat at my sleek desk, looking out at the city lights, I felt the first thrilling taste of power. They had thrown me out with nothing. They thought I had vanished, a sad, forgotten old woman. They had no idea that the predator they should be fearing wasn't a rival corporation or a Wall Street shark. It was the woman they had left for dead, and I was just beginning to buy the chain they had so foolishly put on. The first real shot I fired wasn't aimed at the stock market. It was aimed at a dusty workshop in Ohio. Jessica's research had identified a critical vulnerability. Pierce Industries relied on a single family-owned company, MJB Alloys, for a patented metal composite essential for their flagship product line. The report also noted that MJB was struggling, quietly drowning in debt after a few bad years. They were ripe for a takeover, but Mark's approach, according to Jessica's sources, had been predatory, a lowball offer to buy them out and absorb their patent. It had insulted the owner, a third-generation machinist named Sam Kowalski. I didn't want to be a predator. I wanted to be a savior. As Eleanor Stone, head of a private equity firm specializing in revitalizing American manufacturing, I flew to Ohio. I didn't arrive in a chauffeured town car. I rented a Ford and drove myself to their facility. I met Sam not in a boardroom, but on the factory floor, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and machine oil. I listened as he spoke with pride about his grandfather starting the business and with pain about the prospect of losing it. I didn't make him an offer to buy. I made him an offer to invest. Athena Strategic Holdings cleared MJB's debt, upgraded their equipment, and gave them a capital infusion that brought tears to the old man's eyes. In return, I asked for a controlling interest and an exclusive supply contract. A week later, MJB Alloys formally terminated their month-to-month agreement with Pierce Industries. The effect was immediate. Production lines in Connecticut ground to a halt. Mark scrambled, trying to find another supplier capable of replicating the complex alloy, but it was a patented process. He was cut off. The first quarterly report after my move showed a catastrophic drop in production and a significant loss. I read the news in my Philadelphia loft and felt a cold, clean satisfaction. I hadn't just hurt his company. I had empowered his victim. With the company bleeding from a tangible wound, it was time to attack its ghost, its reputation. Mark and David were trying to spin the supply chain issue as a temporary setback, a story of a small-time partner who couldn't keep up with their dynamic growth. I needed to change that narrative. I called Jessica. I want you to become a ghostwriter, I told her. Working with her network of financial journalists and online forum trolls, we began a subtle but persistent campaign. Anonymously sourced concerns began to pop up. A respected industry blog would run a piece asking, "Is the leadership at Pierce Industries too green to manage its legacy?" A comment on an investor forum, seemingly from a disgruntled mid-level employee, would mention closed-door arguments and reckless spending. The rumors were never libelous, always couched in questions and feigned concern. We whispered about instability. We hinted at a growing rift between the brilliant but arrogant CEO and his CO. We painted a picture of a company in chaos, piloted by two cowboys who had seized control only to immediately run the ship aground. The stock, already shaky from the production news, began a slow, steady, sickening slide. Mark was fighting a battle on two fronts, and one of his enemies was a phantom he couldn't even see. It was time to activate my pawn. David Chen was the snake in my son's garden, and I now held the proof of his own venomous secrets. The offshore betting accounts, the wire transfers to bookies in Macau, the digital trail of his skimming from company coffers. I didn't contact him directly. That was too risky. Instead, I had Jessica arrange for a special delivery. A courier dropped a plain, unmarked envelope at David Chen's lavish suburban home. Inside there was no letter, no demand. There was only a single glossy photograph of him at a high-stakes poker table in an illegal backroom casino, a photo Jessica's operative had taken from across the room. Also inside was a bank statement from one of his undeclared accounts, with 3 recent damning transactions circled in red ink. At the bottom of the page, a single sentence was typed in a sterile, block font. "We own you." I imagined him finding it. Cold sweat. The panicked realization that his secret life was no longer secret. He wouldn't know who sent it. A rival. A loan shark. It didn't matter. The ambiguity was the point. An unknown, all-seeing enemy was far more terrifying than a familiar one. From that moment on, David Chen was no longer Mark Pierce's partner. He was my asset. My first instruction to David was delivered through a disposable burner phone, the text message self-deleting seconds after being read. It was simple. Advise Mark to double down. Panicked and pliable, David obeyed. He went to Mark with a story of confidence and aggression. He argued that the supply issue was temporary and that the stock drop was a market overreaction. The solution, he insisted, was to show strength. Under David's catastrophic guidance, Mark made a series of fatal errors. He spent millions in cash reserves trying to fast-track a new, unproven supplier, resulting in a batch of faulty materials that had to be scrapped. At David's urging, he signed a disastrously one-sided shipping contract, locking the company into exorbitant rates for the next 2 years. He poured money into a PR campaign to combat the rumors, which only made the company look more defensive and unstable. From my loft, I watched the cash reserves dwindle and the operational costs soar. Mark, blinded by his own hubris and trusting the very man who was gutting him, was furious. He fired 2 vice presidents. He blamed disloyal employees. He ranted about conspiracies in the media. He never once looked at the man sitting right next to him. David was hollowing out the company from the inside, and Mark was handing him the shovel. After 6 months of relentless, systematic pressure, Pierce Industries was a hollowed-out shell. The stock price was in the gutter. It was crippled by debt, most of which I now quietly owned. Its cash reserves were gone, and its production was at a standstill. It was time to close the trap. I called Mr. Davies. "It's time, Arthur." The next morning, the board of directors of Pierce Industries received a formal, unsolicited offer. Athena Strategic Holdings proposed to acquire a 51% controlling stake in the company. The offer was low, a fraction of the company's value a year ago, but it was all cash. It wasn't just an offer. It was a lifeline. It was the only viable path to avoid a complete collapse and bankruptcy. The news hit the financial world like a thunderclap. A mysterious, cash-rich fund had cornered one of the industry's legacy names. I could picture the scene in the Greenwich boardroom. Panic. The furious, impotent rage on my son's face as he realized he had been outmaneuvered at every turn. He was trapped. The board, whose only loyalty was to the bottom line, would see the offer as their only salvation. They were being asked to choose between a disastrous, failed CEO and a mysterious savior with bottomless pockets. His name was on the letterhead, but my hands were around the company's throat. He was about to lose everything. The only thing left was to look him in the eye while he did. The hostile takeover bid sent Mark into a frantic tailspin. From the dispassionate distance of my Philadelphia loft, I monitored his demise through Jessica's reports and the steady stream of financial news. He was a caged animal, rattling the bars of a prison he had built himself. He scrambled to secure emergency funding, flying to New York and then Chicago, begging for a capital infusion from the very banks that had already sold his debt to my shell corporation. Every door was slammed in his face. No one would invest in a company with a cratered stock price, a non-existent supply chain, and a leadership team that was now radioactive. He was a pariah. The final blow came not from me, but from his own chosen partner. The day before the board was scheduled to vote, David Chen vanished. He emptied his personal accounts, liquidated what assets he could, and disappeared. He left behind a note for Mark, a single typed line on his desk. "You should have taken the first offer." Mark was utterly alone now, stranded on the wreckage of the empire he had stolen. The last of his allies was gone, his money was gone, and his reputation was a smoldering ruin. He was cornered, with no one to blame but the reflection in the mirror. The day the board was scheduled to meet and formally accept my offer, I allowed myself a moment of quiet. I sat by my window, watching the morning light glint off the river. The anger that had fueled me for nearly a year had cooled, settling into something hard and clear like steel. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about justice. I picked up the secure burner phone I used for my most sensitive communications. I typed a new message, not to David Chen or Mr. Davies, but to the personal cell number of my son. He wouldn't recognize the number. The message was short. "Think we should talk. The old coffee shop. 3 p.m. I attached a single photo to the message, a scanned image from a faded album. It was of me and a much younger Mark, maybe 7 years old, sitting in a booth at a small, unpretentious diner called the Daily Grind. He was grinning, a smear of hot chocolate on his upper lip, and I was looking at him with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. I hit send. The message was a ghost, an echo from a life he had chosen to burn down. The Daily Grind hadn't changed. The same red vinyl booths, the same checkered floor, the same smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon. I chose the exact booth from the photograph and ordered a black coffee, waiting. He arrived 10 minutes late, a vain attempt to project power he no longer had. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He scanned the diner, his gaze sweeping right past me. He was looking for a corporate shark, a rival in a suit. He wasn't looking for his mother. I had become Eleanor Stone. My posture was straight, my clothes impeccably tailored, my expression unreadable. "Mark," I said, my voice even and calm. He whipped his head around. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like that 7-year-old boy again, shocked and bewildered. The shock quickly curdled into a snarl of disbelief and rage. "You," he breathed, sliding into the booth opposite me. "This was you. All of it. The rumors, the supplier, the takeover. You did this." "I did," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "How?" he sputtered, his voice rising. "With what? I left you with nothing. You were nothing." "You were mistaken," I replied, my voice as cold as the day he threw me out. "You thought you took everything. But you only took the things that didn't matter." I laid it all out for him, right there in the worn-out vinyl booth. I told him about Eleanor Stone. I told him about the ghost accounts, the discreet law firm, and the plan his father and I had put in place more than a decade ago. I told him about the Phoenix Clause. His face cycled through shock, denial, and finally, a hollowed-out understanding. But the final piece of the story was the one that broke him. "This wasn't just my plan, Mark," I said, leaning forward. "It was his. Your father saw this in you. He saw the greed, the cruelty, the emptiness. He saw it years before he died." Tears welled in his eyes, hot tears of shame and fury. "No," he whispered. "Dad wouldn't. He loved me." "He did love you," I affirmed, my voice softening for just a moment. "He loved you so much that your character broke his heart. He knew you would try to destroy his legacy to feed your own ego. And he knew you would discard me like an old piece of furniture. So he made a choice. He protected his life's work, and he protected me. This entire plan. It was his last act of love. Not for you, Mark. For me. I let the truth settle in the space between us. I was Athena Strategic Holdings. I was the mysterious investor who held his debt. I was the force that had dismantled his life with surgical precision. I owned his company, his future, everything. The empire he stole was now mine, one with a legitimacy he could never claim. He sat there, utterly defeated. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, empty silence. He was a boy again, stripped of his power, his pride, and his inheritance. He was exactly as I had been that night on the curb. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice a raw whisper. "What more can you possibly take?" "I don't want anything from you," I said simply. "It's all mine now. The company will be restructured, reorganized under a new name. The Pierce legacy, as you defined it, is over." I reached into my purse and placed a simple white business card on the table. "However," I continued, "I am going to give you something I was never given. A choice." He stared at the card. "Choice 1. You can walk out of this diner with nothing. No money, no prospects, no name. You can experience the world exactly as you left me to experience it. Or choice 2. I tapped the card. "That is the address of a manufacturing plant we own in Michigan. There is a job waiting for you. An entry-level position on the assembly line. You'll work for a living, earn a modest paycheck, and live in a small apartment. You will learn the value of work, the meaning of humility, and the sting of earning respect instead of inheriting it." I stood up, leaving the card on the table between us. He looked up at me, his face a mask of anguish. He was searching for a sign, a hint of what I wanted him to do. Gave him none. "You will earn your place in the world, Mark," I said, my voice clear and final. "Or you will have no place at all." I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving him alone at the table with his two futures. The sun was bright outside, and for the first time in a year I wasn't looking back. I was no longer a victim, a ghost, or an instrument of vengeance. I was Eleanor Stone, and I was the architect of my own justice. And so I walked away, leaving him at that table with his two futures. My revenge was over, but his story was just beginning. Now I leave the final question to you. He was left with a choice. A life of hard work on the factory floor, or a life on the streets with nothing. Tell me in the comments what you think he chose. More importantly, if you think I should have just walked away and left him with nothing, tell me why. I'll be reading every comment to see if my mercy was my final victory. Or my final mistake. Thank you for following my story.